The gambling men at the local outpost weren't discussing if he would fail. They were placing money on exactly when they would discover his frozen corpse. It wasn't that Lars Erikson was careless or lacked supplies. It was that he had committed a heresy against frontier survival. While every other chimney in the valley belched smoke day and night to keep the lethal cold at bay, Lars had buried his stove plumbing into a massive grave of rocks beneath his floorboards. On the night the great blizzard struck, the kind of storm that freezes breath in the throat, he did the unthinkable. He stopped feeding the fire. No roaring flames, no glowing cast iron, no mountain of furs on his bunk. Outside, the mercury plunged toward 40 degrees below zero. Inside, Lars slept in a thin wool shirt, waking only once. He didn't wake from shivering, but from the eerie sensation that his home was defying the laws of nature. 6 miles north of the Teton River, in a lonely settlement west of Fort Benton, his neighbors were engaged in a desperate battle for survival. Men dragged themselves from bed every hour to stoke voracious stoves. Water buckets turned into solid blocks of ice even when placed near the hearth. Ice crystals bloomed along the interior logs like white mold. Yet, in a cabin exposed on a barren ridge, stripped of any windbreak, a Swedish newcomer was betting his life on 4 tons of granite to do what fire usually did. The mockery had begun months earlier. That autumn, while sensible men were felling timber and sealing drafty chinks in their walls, Lars spent 6 grueling weeks hauling stones from the river. He selected round granite boulders, some the size of pumpkins, others as heavy as anvils, and packed them into a 3-foot excavation beneath his cabin floor. Then, he routed his iron stovepipes down into this pit of rocks before venting the smoke outside. At Morrison's trading post, the locals shook their heads. Erikson's cracked, they muttered. Playing with stones when winter's coming? They wagered he wouldn't last until Christmas. But they were missing the fundamental insight. Lars wasn't trying to create a hotter fire. He was building a battery for heat. And when the whiteout descended in November of 1867, it would decide if he was a visionary or just another dead fool in the snow. Winter arrived early that year in the Montana Territory. By early November, the valleys west of Fort Benton were already gripping 15 below zero. The veterans at the trading post spoke in hushed tones, recognizing the signs of a killing winter. It was the type of season that would break the spirit of anyone unprepared for this unforgiving landscape. And in that rough-hewn cabin north of the river, Lars Erikson was about to execute a maneuver that would rewrite the rules of frontier heating. Lars had come to the territory 3 years prior with little more than tools, a rifle, and the stubbornness required to push west. He had spent his first winter hugging a cast-iron stove, feeding it timber every 2 hours, waking up to see his breath in the air despite the fire being arm's length away. He watched water freeze indoors. He felt the cold draft slide through the log joints like a thief. He knew, with the clarity of a man who had almost perished, that the standard method was flawed. The frontier rulebook was simple: build tight, plug gaps, burn wood fast, and never let the fire die. It was ancestral wisdom, passed down because it kept people alive. Barely. No one challenged it. Until Lars. His peers thought he had snapped when they witnessed his autumn construction project. While they built wood piles, Lars hauled river rock. He chose each stone with an artisan's eye. He constructed a timber framework beneath his floor joists, 3 feet deep, spanning the length of his 18 by 24-foot dwelling. Into this crib, he packed the stones, creating a thermal mass weighing nearly 8,000 pounds. Then came the part that provoked laughter. He connected his stove exhaust to a serpentine network of pipes, snaking through this rock bed, forcing the smoke and heat to travel through the mass before exiting. Erikson's gone soft. They joked at the post. They placed bets on his surrender date. None of them grasped the physics Lars had internalized back in Sweden. He hadn't learned it from a textbook, but by observing how masonry heaters and bread ovens in the old country handled energy. Lars knew that cast iron was excellent at radiating intense heat, but terrible at holding it. The second the fuel was gone, the iron went cold. But stone-dense, heavy stone was different. Stone had a memory. If you could saturate stone with heat, it would sip that energy and hold it for hours, even days. You could build a home that remained temperate through the long night without burning a single stick of wood. His cabin sat on a rise overlooking the valley, surrounded by pines but open to the gale force winds screaming off the Rockies. Settlers usually avoided such exposure. Lars chose it on purpose. He wanted no windbreak to obscure the results. When his system worked and he was convinced it would, he wanted zero doubt about why he survived while others froze. The labor had been punishing. He walked the half-mile to the creek hundreds of times. His hands cycled through blisters and calluses until his palms were like leather. He notched cottonwood logs to build a foundation capable of supporting the immense tonnage. He arranged the stones with precision, large boulders at the base, smaller rocks filling the voids to maximize surface contact. Between these layers, he poured sand hauled from a distant gravel bar, filling the air gaps to ensure heat conducted directly from stone to stone. The plumbing was the true engineering feat. He salvaged 6-inch iron piping from a defunct mine, bending and fitting it to create a tortuous path through the rock bed. The hot exhaust would travel 30 feet through the granite before escaping. He also installed clean-out ports, knowing soot and creosote would eventually choke the draft if left unchecked. It was precise work, drawing on his past life as a ship's carpenter, calculating angles and flow with intuition rather than calculus. By late October, the system was sealed beneath his floorboards, invisible. The stove looked normal, sitting in the center of the room, except the pipe went down instead of up. The exhaust vent popped out of the ground outside. "Where's the chimney?" visitors asked. Lars just smiled. "Wait and see." The validation he sought arrived on November 12th. A blizzard roared down from Canada, catching even the elders off guard. Temperatures hit -30, winds clocked 70 miles per hour, driving snow through the tiniest cracks. It was a storm that killed cattle and men indiscriminately. Lars had been running his stove for 3 weeks prior, charging his thermal battery. He burned a modest fire daily, just enough to send hot gas winding through the rock labyrinth beneath his feet. He estimated it would take 2 weeks to fully saturate the 4 tons of granite. After that, the stone would act as a massive reservoir of energy. His neighbors prepared for a siege. They stacked wood inside, hung blankets over windows, and moved beds dangerously close to their stoves. They braced for the exhausting cycle of feed, fires, leap, repeat. When the storm hit, Lars did the unthinkable. He let the fire die. He had burned a hot fire all morning, heating the iron until it glowed and the pipes hummed. Then, at noon, with the wind shrieking and the temperature plummeting, he stopped. He cleaned the ash box. And he waited. What the neighbors couldn't see was that the rock bed beneath the floor had absorbed a colossal amount of energy. The granite, heated to nearly 190 degrees, held enough BTS to warm the cabin for days. The stone was now radiating that heat upward, slowly and steadily. In a standard cabin, the temperature would drop within an hour. Within 3 hours, water would freeze. Within 6, it would be light. But in Lars's cabin, warmed by the massive thermal inertia below, the air held steady at 64 degrees. The physics were elegant. Stone has a high specific heat capacity. It takes a lot of energy to heat up, but it releases that energy reluctantly. The mathematical reality was staggering. His stone bed held approximately 200,000 BTUs of usable heat. A cord of wood contains millions of BTUs, but in a normal stove, 80% of that heat shoots up the chimney and warms the sky. Lars captured that waste and banked it in the rock. But numbers meant nothing compared to the feeling of that first night. As the world outside dropped to 40 below, the real test began. Across the valley, families huddled in fear. Men woke constantly to feed flames. The margin between safety and death was measured in firewood. Lars, however, slept in his undershirt, on top of his blankets. He awoke once, not from cold, but from the shock of comfort. He placed a hand on the floorboards. They were warm, not hot, just a gentle, radiating presence. The room had cooled only 2 degrees, 262. The stone had found its equilibrium. The blizzard raged for 4 days. By day 2, neighbors feared the worst for Lars. They knew his woodpile was small. Some discussed a rescue mission, assuming he was freezing or dead, but the snowdrifts made travel suicide. They could only wait. Lars spent those 4 days in a surreal bubble of comfort. He lit a small fire only to cook, burning perhaps 3 logs a day compared to the 30 his neighbors consumed. Even that brief cooking fire recharged the stone bed. He realized that 2 hours of fire daily was enough to maintain 62 degrees indefinitely. The stone acted as a flywheel, smoothing out the temperature spikes. He read by lamplight, slept soundly, and used 1/10 the fuel of his peers. He had no risk of chimney fires. His indoor air was clean, free of the constant smoke puffing from stoked stoves. He had engineered a solution the frontier desperately needed: high-efficiency heating using nothing but local rock and scrap metal. The science relied on 3 pillars. First, thermal mass the battery. Second, radiant floor heating. Heat rising from the floor is far more comfortable than heat radiating from a single hot box in the room. In a normal cabin, the ceiling is hot and the floor is freezing. Lars flipped this. Third, waste heat capture. Conventional stoves vent exhaust at 500 degrees. Lars stripped that heat into the stones until the smoke exiting his house was barely lukewarm. He was squeezing every drop of energy from the wood. When the storm broke on the 5th day, men dug out of drifts that reached their eaves. The first priority was checking on the crazy Swede. Thomas Morrison and the Dietrich brothers fought through waist-deep snow to reach Lars's ridge. They expected a corpse. What they found shattered their worldview. Lars opened the door in his shirt sleeves. Warmth spilled out, causing steam to rise in the frigid air. Condensation beaded on his windows on the inside. His stove was cold. No smoke rose from the vent. The men stood there, ice in their beards, staring at a scene that defied logic. "How are you alive?" Morrison demanded, suspicious of some trick. Lars invited them in. He lifted a floorboard to show the granite. He explained the pipes, the saturation, the thermal lag. He made them touch the warm floor. He pointed to his woodpile, barely touched, while theirs were decimated. Then he dropped a statistic that would become legend. "I burn 1 cord of wood a winter," he told them. "How many do you burn?" Morrison burned 6. The Dietrichs burned 7. The math was brutal. Lars lived in superior comfort using a fraction of the resources. In a land where chopping wood was dangerous, calorie-draining labor, this was a revolution. News traveled faster than a prairie fire. Within a week, everyone within 50 miles knew about the rock-heated cabin. Skepticism turned to curiosity. Visitors trekked to see the miracle. Lars welcomed them, explaining the system to anyone who would listen. The Dietrich brothers were the first converts. They did the math. 7 cords meant 40 days of hard labor, chopping and hauling. Cutting that to 1 cord gave them a month of their lives back. They started digging their own pits immediately, unwilling to face another winter the old way. By spring, 1868, 7 cabins were being retrofitted. By autumn, 23 new settlers sought out Lars before laying their foundations. The technique spread to Idaho and Wyoming. Modifications appeared: sandstone usage, clay tiles, standardized manifolds. But the core principle remained. Failures happened, of course. Some dug shallow pits and found the heat faded too fast. Some routed pipes poorly, causing smoke to back up. The community learned together. They found that 30 to 40 feet of pipe was the sweet spot. They learned to dry creek stones thoroughly to prevent steam explosions. By 1872, 5 years later, the stone bed system was standard in the region. One sawmill owner estimated the technique saved 3,000 cords of wood that year alone, representing 300 years of human labor saved. The safety benefits were equally profound. No red-hot iron meant fewer burns for children. No constant stoking meant fewer accidental house fires. The method even changed where people lived. Because they needed less wood, settlers could homestead on the open prairie, miles from timber, hauling their meager annual supply with ease. Lars never patented it. He could have been rich, but he had come to build a life, not a fortune. His payment was the respect of his neighbors and the knowledge that he was saving lives. This truth became stark during the starvation winter of 1871. Temperatures hit 50 below. Game vanished. Families were trapped. Those with stone beds survived on reduced rations because they didn't burn vital calories fighting the cold or chopping wood. It's estimated over 100 lives were saved that winter due to Lars's design. Lars himself fed 3 neighboring families from his own stores, which he had been able to stock because he wasn't busy chopping wood all autumn. By 1875, manuals were being printed in Bozeman. The method moved east. Even the men who had mocked him became evangelists. Morrison, the man who bet against him, recommended the system to every newcomer. Lars continued to tinker, adding water heating coils and testing stone arrangements. He eventually married Helga, a widow who admitted the warm cabin was a major selling point. They lived there for decades, raising children in a home that was a marvel of engineering. Modern builders rediscovered these principles in the 1970s, often unaware they were channeling a Swedish immigrant from the 1860s. Lars died in 1902, a hero of the territory. His cabin stood until the 1950s, the stones still in place, a monument to the idea that sometimes the craziest solution is the only one that makes sense. Lars Erikson's story isn't just about heating. It's about the courage to look at a problem everyone accepts and ask if there's a better way. It's about the resilience to endure laughter while you build something they can't understand yet. The warmth that saved the Teton Valley wasn't just from the granite. It was from the realization that wisdom often looks like madness until it works. If you found value in this story of frontier ingenuity, please hit the like button and subscribe to Winds of Thought for more history that challenges the way we think.